Joining us now is Professor Abel Esterhuyse from the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenboch University. Professor, it's good to speak to you this afternoon. What was your initial reaction to the allegations made by the US ambassador regarding South Africa's alleged supply of ammunition to Russia for the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's two critical issues here. The first point to make is that perhaps the US won't have had the statement issued if they weren't quite sure of the information. They would have been cautious in issuing such an important warning and such an important declaration and statement. So that's the first point. It concerns intelligence. The second point, I think, is an important one. I think the US is using this message as a message to the rest of the world. And the message is that the US will tolerate neutrality on the war between Ukraine and Russia, but the US won't tolerate anything beyond that. In other words, they won't tolerate the shipment and the selling of weapon systems to the Russian to the Russian government, and I think that is my takeaway from this whole issue.
Well, I suppose, Professor, it does raise the question of what is neutrality in this relationship, if you will, between the United States and South Africa, pertaining specifically to Russia.
Well, it raises questions about neutrality. It raises questions about South Africa's declaration of non-alignment. The question is whether South Africa is providing the same kind of interaction and support to Ukraine that it is providing to Russia. Whether we see the same kind of diplomatic interaction between Russia and Ukraine and Ukraine South Africa. We have seen an ANC delegation visiting Russia. We haven't seen a ANC delegation visiting Ukraine. So there's no doubt, and I have to be clear on this, there's no doubt that South Africa is not neutral anymore. South Africa's stance on this war is clearly seen as in support of Russia, and that is clearly through the ANC's behavior as a political party. In visiting Russia and in its own declarations is what it is saying.
Now, in your experience, how common is it for a foreign ship like the Russian vessel Lady R to dock in a South African port and potentially load ammunition?
Well, there's a cloud of secrecy around this whole ship incident. It is now becoming a sort of a Waterkloof 2 type of incident. But let me say, the very secretive way in which the ship arrived here, its communications switched off, pitching up in a military base in Simonstown, speculation about an apparent loading that was done, loading of the ship, government reactions to and government clearly avoiding any kind of definite answers as to what the ship was doing in South Africa. And of course, I mean, the president's reaction yesterday in Parliament was in many ways bizarre. It was in many ways almost disingenuous in its response. And now it has become a major issue. It has become an international issue. It's on the news headlines around the world. And we've seen it playing out in the economic sector as well, with the rand that is now taking a bit of a punishment.
Now, according to the Department of International Relations Foreign Policy paper, and I know you've got some thoughts on this, South Africa aims to advance its national interest in a global environment. How do these allegations aligning or conflict with those principles outlined in that paper?
Well, there's an interesting, I think, disconnect here between the ANC's interest as a political party and the country's national interest. I think that's the first point we have to make. The second disconnect, in my opinion, is the disconnect between political interest that's pursued by government and the South African government that is clearly in line with what is unfolding in the BRICS environment, and our economic interest that is predominantly more orientated, I should say, towards Europe and the United States. And then, of course, there's also questions about the disconnect between party support and alignment with Russia vis-à-vis societal support and alignment with Russia. So we're sitting with an interesting dichotomy and certain tensions here in South Africa's management of its stance towards the war in Ukraine and the spin-offs from that.
So let's talk about issues of national security, and obviously Ambassador Brigety suggesting or making these allegations about weapons being provided and loaded onto Lady R. Is it a case of, excuse the phrasing, but is this a case of the Americans spying on South Africa? Is this what happened? Is this how they've gathered intelligence?
I doubt. I mean, every single person in South Africa knew about the ship that arrived in December. It was in the media. It was, and so that's the first point to be made. The second point to be made is that, they're sitting with, attaché people in South Africa, military attachés. They're sitting with a lot of Americans that's serving in diplomatic posts, and they keep an eye on what is unfolding inside South Africa. Is it spying? No, it is perhaps just taking note of what is going on in South Africa. Is it spying? Yes, it's perhaps spying in the sense that they are asking questions, difficult questions sometimes to people that they're not supposed to ask it to. So yes and no, but this is precisely why we have diplomatic relations with countries. Our diplomats are doing precisely the same where they are stationed around the world. We maintain an interest in those countries, and this is precisely what the U.S. Is doing here. It's maintaining an interest in South Africa, and if it has an interest in South Africa, which we know it has, it is, of course, watching what is unfolding inside the country.
So what do we read into this? If, as you suggest, that all this happened in clear view, everybody was able to see what's transpired, so that if South Africa did go ahead and give those arms to Russia in broad daylight, so to speak, what does it suggest about South Africa's certainly international relations with the United States and other countries?
Well, let me first say this. I'm not so sure that we actually provided weapon systems to Russia, because South African weapon systems are predominantly orientated towards the West. In other words, we're using standard NATO caliber weapon systems. That's not really aligned with what Russia is using. So if we exported weaponry to Russia, it was probably propellant for artillery or command and control kind of systems. And then, of course, we need to keep the current capacity of the NEL in mind if we talk about this. And we also need to keep in mind that South Africa's weapons manufacturing is tied into the international weapon manufacturing companies, and most of them are Western companies, so they will already sort of red flag any possibility of selling weapons to Russia. So we need to ask questions about South Africa's ability to actually sell anything to Russia. And then we need to understand that in the case of South Africa, we need to adhere to national and international regulations and stipulations. There's approvals, a whole range of approvals that's outlined in the Conventional Arms Control Act, and user certificates, etc., and approval by Parliament. So if they exported weapons without these processes being followed, then we're actually sitting with a huge problem here, because then it is in many ways a constitutional crisis, because then people haven't followed the clear outlines that's required in terms of legislation and in terms of the law.
Well, fine, let's talk about reaction and how President Cyril Ramaphosa has reacted. It wasn't a reaction of denial. No, we didn't do this. It was, we will institute an investigation. How do you think the South African government should respond to these allegations, both in terms of diplomatic actions and internal investigations?
Yeah, to be quite honest with you, I think the President's reaction was and should be seen against the background of domestic politics. It should not be seen against the background of our foreign policy. It should be seen against the background of what is domestically unfolding. And by appointing a commission of inquiry, I think he's playing for time. And why is he playing for time? Well, hopefully the commission will only report after the elections of next year. And hopefully by that time, the war in Ukraine would have been closer to an outcome. We would have by that time seen what is unfolding in Ukraine. So he has done the old political trick in domestic politics of kicking the ball into and out of the field and asking for a board of inquiry. It's going to take time. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process. Be a lot of speculation, but it will serve as a sort of a cool-off period, and then we will know what is at the heart of this. But let me say this: there's a paper trail. If weapons were actually sold to Russia, there ought to be a paper trail, and that's the easiest way to track this, is to follow the paper trail. Who authorized it? Who signed it off? There ought to be a clear paper trail on this. And, as the minister and the president and the whole bureaucracy that is working in this field ought to be in the know about these kind of activities. So, yeah, I don't see this as anything more than the president playing for time here.
Professor Abel, I appreciate your time, and he's Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University.